The scream wasn't long. It was short, sharp, like someone had inhaled and their body forced the sound out before their mind could even decide what it meant. It cut through the rainforest noise, the constant living static of insects and distant birds, and it carried across the retreat grounds in a way that made heads lift, even in the middle of meditation. The retreat director heard it while he was guiding a group session not far from the bungalows. People later said he didn't even finish the sentence he was on. 1 second, he was seated, calm and composed, voice low and steady. The next, he was standing, then running. The bungalows were simple structures, small, mostly for sleeping, linked to communal spaces where guests could make tea and share meals in quiet, respectful silence. This wasn't a party place. It wasn't a hostel. It was supposed to feel safe, controlled, grounded. That scream made it feel like none of those words mattered anymore. When the director reached the nearest bungalow row, he saw one of his staff members standing rigidly in a doorway, her hands half lifted, her face drained of color, like her body had gone cold all at once. She didn't speak. She didn't step back. She just stared into the room as if her eyes had locked onto something they couldn't stop seeing. The director moved beside her and looked inside. And in that one glance, it wasn't just that something terrible had happened. It was that something terrible had happened in the one way he had spent the whole retreat trying to prevent. On the morning of August 8th, 2024, a 48-year-old Russian woman named Liudmila Lazarenko sat on the floor of her bungalow deep in the Amazon rainforest in Peru. It was early enough that the light coming through the gaps and windows had that pale, washed look, bright but softened by humidity. Everything felt damp out there. Even the wood smelled wet. The air clung to skin. Breath felt thick. Liudmila sat with her legs crossed, eyes closed, trying to meditate. But the rainforest is not the kind of place that goes quiet just because you want it to. Outside, insects buzzed in layers. Birds called back and forth. There were tiny sounds that felt too close, like something crawling across leaves just beyond the wall. Inside, from the attached communal kitchen space, came the ordinary sounds of someone moving around. A mug set down, a kettle shifted, the soft scrape of something on a counter. That was her friend, Ivan Kuzmin, 38, from Ukraine, brewing tea. Eventually, Liudmila's focus broke. She opened her eyes, let out a quiet breath, and looked toward the kitchen. Ivan was doing something simple, almost domestic, preparing 2 mugs like it was a normal morning at home. And it's important to say this clearly, because people love to invent drama when they hear married woman and male friend traveling together. Liudmila and Ivan were platonic friends. Liudmila was married and had 2 kids back home. She wasn't here with her family. She was here alone, taking time away from the constant weight of daily responsibility. And Ivan, he was here for his own reasons, similar reasons. That's why they became friends in the first place. They'd been attending retreats like this for about 2 years, and that's how they met. 2 people from different places, pulled toward the same kind of reset. They weren't thrill seekers. They weren't reckless in the obvious way. They were the kind of people who believed that stepping away from normal life, even briefly, could restore something inside you. This retreat, though, wasn't just quiet meditation. This was an ayahuasca retreat. The brew, often described by attendees as a tea, was central to the experience. People traveled from all over the world to places like this, believing it could offer insight, healing, transformation. Some spoke about processing trauma. Others described it as a spiritual journey. Some said it made them feel like they saw their life from the outside looking in. But the retreat director didn't talk about it with romantic language. He talked about safety. Because ayahuasca isn't just some calming herbal drink. It's a powerful hallucinogen. And the whole point of taking it in this kind of setting is to enter an altered state. That altered state can be beautiful for some people. And for others, it can be a nightmare you can't wake up from. Which is why, from the very start, the director made one rule so clear it almost felt like a warning label you couldn't ignore. Never drink ayahuasca without a shaman present. Not recommended, not best practice. Never. It didn't matter if you were new. It didn't matter if you'd done it a dozen times. Because if a person has a bad trip, they can lose the ability to tell hallucination from reality. Fear becomes certainty. A false belief becomes a mission. And without someone trained and sober in the room, the person in that state can become a danger. Not because they're evil, but because their brain has stopped interpreting the world correctly. The shaman's job isn't just spiritual guidance. The shaman's job is to keep you from hurting yourself or someone else. Everyone at the retreat heard that rule. Liudmila heard it, Ivan heard it, and still somewhere between the quiet morning and the heat and the confidence that comes from familiarity, they began to treat the rule like it was for other people. There's a particular kind of danger in feeling experienced. When you're new to something, you respect it. You hesitate. You follow instructions. But when you've done it before, when you've survived every prior time, your brain starts to file it under manageable. You start thinking, I know how this goes. I can handle it. I'm not going to be the person who loses control. Liudmila and Ivan had done retreats like this for years. They'd participated in ceremonies. They weren't ignorant of the risks. That's what makes what happened feel so unsettling afterward. Because this wasn't a case of someone not knowing. This was a case of someone deciding the warning didn't apply anymore. At some point that morning, they chose to do what the director had explicitly forbidden: drink ayahuasca without a shaman present. They weren't in a ceremonial circle. They weren't surrounded by staff. They weren't being guided. They were in their bungalow, private, quiet, away from scrutiny. Ivan brewed the ayahuasca tea in the attached kitchen. And that detail matters too, because the retreat provided structure, boundaries, a sense that someone else was in charge. But in that bungalow, Ivan became the one in charge. He prepared 2 mugs. Then he carried them into the sleeping area, where Liudmila sat waiting, still on the floor, still in that calm posture people adopt when they're trying to convince themselves everything is under control. He sat beside her. They drank. And for a moment, nothing dramatic happened. No thunderclap. No instant horror. Just 2 adults lying down on a wooden floor in the damp heat, eyes closed, listening to the rainforest breathe. If you walked past the bungalow at that point, you might have thought they were napping. And that's the creepy part about the early stage of certain tragedies. How normal the outside looks while the inside begins to shift. Time passed. The altered state deepened. And somewhere in the invisible world of their minds, the experience split in 2. Because ayahuasca does not give everyone the same journey, even in the same room, on the same day, drinking from mugs that were brewed together. Some people feel calm. Some people feel clarity. Some people feel like they're dissolving into something peaceful. And some people feel like they've been dropped into an emergency they're obligated to solve. Outside the bungalow, the retreat continued. There were schedules, group meditations, quiet meals, staff moving between spaces, making sure people had what they needed. The director was busy. He was guiding a group session, not very far from the bungalow area. Everything, for everyone else, seemed normal. And when tragedy begins behind a closed door, that normality becomes almost unbearable to picture later, because it means there was a window of time where intervention might have been possible, if anyone had known. But nobody knew. Not yet. In a place like the rainforest, silence doesn't necessarily feel suspicious. People come here for silence. People come here to be alone. People lie down for hours, eyes closed, processing whatever is happening in their minds. So the fact that the bungalow stayed quiet didn't immediately trigger alarm. Until it did. Until a staff member walked close enough to look in. Maybe to check. Maybe to call them to something. Maybe because she simply noticed an absence and wanted to make sure they were okay. And then she screamed. The scream reached the director mid-session. He stood up instantly and ran toward the bungalow row, leaving the group behind. People later might have described it as instinct, like his body already understood what his mind was still catching up to. When he arrived, the staff member who screamed was standing at the doorway of Liudmila and Ivan's bungalow, frozen in place. Her posture said more than words ever could. The director stepped beside her and looked inside. And in that single moment, two realizations slammed into him. First, Liudmila and Ivan had broken the rule. Because the scene inside looked like what happens when no one is guiding, no one is grounding, no one is there to stop a person from acting on something that isn't real. Second, whatever had happened, it wasn't something you undo. It wasn't a close call. It was aftermath. This is where the story becomes hard to tell cleanly, because it involves a mind that wasn't operating under normal rules anymore. Ayahuasca can cause hallucinations so vivid that the person experiencing them cannot tell they're hallucinating. In a bad trip, fear doesn't feel like fear. It feels like proof. The person doesn't think I'm scared. They think something is happening, something is wrong, something is here. And according to what was later understood from the incident described, Liudmila was having a good trip. Ivan was not. Ivan experienced a severe, terrifying, altered state, one where his perception turned against him. In that state, he came to believe something frightening and specific, that Liudmila had become possessed by evil spirits, and that he needed to save her soul. And this is the most dangerous part of certain hallucinations. They don't just show you scary images. They give you a mission. They make you feel responsible for stopping an imagined disaster. So Ivan acted. He used a metal bottle to attack Liudmila. Then he went to the communal kitchen and took a knife. What followed was not a fight between two equal people. It was a one-sided, devastating act, committed in a state where Ivan believed he was doing something necessary, something righteous, even though it was not reality. When the staff member looked in and screamed, what she saw wasn't just the result of violence. She saw Ivan still inside the altered state, still under the influence, looking toward the doorway and smiling, with an expression people later described as detached and unrecognizable. Not like a person caught in shock, like a person who wasn't fully back in the room yet. A photograph was taken shortly after the discovery, showing Ivan sitting on the ground, close to what he had done, still clearly affected, appearing like someone who had stepped into a nightmare and hadn't found the way out. Eventually, the effects of the ayahuasca wore down enough that Ivan came back to ordinary awareness. That return, coming down from a hallucination, into the physical reality of what you've done might be one of the most haunting parts of the entire incident. Because it means there was a moment when the false world dissolved and the real one remained. And then, hours later, he came down. Like you could tell the trip had finally loosened its grip on him. And once he was back in the real world, he confessed. No big speech, no twisting it into something else. Just confession. After that, he was arrested in Peru, and that was the end of the retreat right there, at least for everyone who had to live with what happened. But what lingers in this story, what sticks under the skin long after the headline part, is how ordinary the beginning was. A woman sitting on the floor trying to meditate. A friend making tea. A retreat meant for peace. And then the quiet, rational thought that breaks so many safety rules in the world. We've done this before. We'll be fine. Because the director's rule wasn't superstition. It wasn't ceremony for ceremony's sake. It was a barrier between an altered mind and the real world. And once that barrier was removed, the mind inside that bungalow became its own authority. That's the unsettling truth here. Not that ayahuasca is mystical or evil, but that in the wrong conditions and without proper supervision, a person can enter a state where they can't recognize reality, and they can't recognize the people they love, and they can't recognize themselves. And then the rainforest keeps humming outside like nothing happened. Birds still call, insects still whine. The retreat grounds still smell like wet wood and warm leaves. But in one bungalow, a choice made in confidence became irreversible. Have you ever been in a moment where you realized, too late, that a small rule was actually the only thing holding disaster back? Let me know in the comments. This was Midnight Horror Society, dark curiosity for sleep. Until your next midnight session, sleep well.